Today I'm going to replace the water pump in my 2016 Hyundai Sonata Hybrid. The pump is also simply referred to as the EWP in Hyundai service bulletins. This video should apply to all 2015 to 2019 7th generation Hyundai Sonata Hybrids. I'm not a mechanic, I'm simply someone who enjoys working on their own cars, and I've been doing it for many years. But please recognize that the procedures I follow may not be those specified by Hyundai or even best practices in general. If you use this video as an aid to work on a car, you accept full responsibility for the outcome. And please always wear safety glasses, appropriate safety gear, and follow established safety guidelines outlined by the manufacturer of the car or any tools or equipment you use. My car has been flashing the check hybrid system turn off engine HEV error message on the dashboard. This has been occurring more frequently, and an OBD scan reports diagnostic trouble code P2600, coolant pump A control circuit open. This technical service bulletin 21EM007H describes this issue and how to replace the electric water pump at a high level. It simply says refer to the shop manual for tasks like draining the radiator, removing the intake manifold, and removing the hybrid starter generator. So I'm just going to have to figure those out on my own. But it was still nice to have a high-level overview of the job. The first thing I'm doing is I'm removing the high voltage from the car, disconnecting it. You pull the cover in the trunk, then there's a piece of styrofoam you remove, and then there is a cover plate that's removed here with two 10mm bolts. Once you remove that, you can get at the safety access. You pull the green, you pull the lever, and that comes out. And that will disconnect the high voltage battery from the car, the power of the high voltage battery from the car. And I suggest you give it a few minutes to bleed off any residual voltage that might be in the system. The 12-volt battery is also in the trunk, and I have opted to also remove the power of the 12-volt battery. I just removed the negative terminal so that the battery is disconnected from the car. So the next thing I'm going to do is drain the radiator fluid, and unfortunately to do that, it looks like we have to remove the front splash shield, and that's held on by several 10mm bolts that are both here, and then there's some recessed areas. And also going out near the wheels, there's a few 10mm bolts. So we're going to remove those and take that shield off. You should have found that that front shield comes off very easily. And I can see a place where I can drain the radiator fluid. However, I think it appears to me that there's a separate HEV for the hybrid system cooling, and there is the main radiator cooling, and I'm not sure which plug that is. So I think I'm going to take off some of this stuff here so I can see in. This is like all modern cars. There's 10 pounds of fudge in a 5-pound box. The downside about hitting your 6th decade and working on your own cars is laying on concrete floors. The upside is that by this point in your life, you have things like heaters, so the garage isn't freezing. And with jobs like this needs several plastic pieces removed. In the old days, I would have had a screwdriver, but now I have the correct tool to pop these out. So I'm going to pop all of these out, and I'm going to remove this air box as well. If there's anything that looks a little tricky, I will video that. Okay, that came off incredibly easily. It pulls right out of here after you pop those 3 plastic buttons in the front. Since I have to pull off the intake manifold, I am going to pull off this piece, but I'm starting to think there's probably no reason whatsoever to pop this out. So why make any more work than I have to? Taking this off looks to be pulling this hose off, loosening this hose clamp, removing there, and another hose clamp on the throttle body. So we're going to do that, and if I have any problems, I'll let you know. Okay, that tube came off without any issue. Now that I have a little bit more room, I've been looking at this, and if I can get the light in there enough to see very well, but move this hose out of the way. There is that white cap there, it's kind of hard to see, but that is actually the correct drain for the radiator, the main radiator on the car. And it has a pipe, I'll show you in the next part of this video, where that drains out. There was another drain plug on the driver's side over here underneath that I at first thought might be the radiator. I'm fairly confident now that that's for the hybrid electric cooling system. Now, as part of this, I am going to have to remove the hybrid starter generator, and I'm going to try at first to not drain that coolant system. The hoses look like they have some play in them. I'm hoping I can remove that and move it off to the side. If I can't, then I'll drain that system. But initially, I'm just going to drain the main radiator. Okay, so that drain plug is right up. You can reach it with your fingers. It's just up here. It's shaped like a wing nut, so I think I can turn that without a problem. There's a hose that goes down and in, and so I actually believe that's going to drain right out of here. That's the bottom of that hose. And to get a drain pan in, I had to take the rear splash shield, and I just folded it back in a little bit. I'm going to put a drain pan here and drain that out. Okay, I not only took off the radiator cap when I drained it, but since I have an air compressor, I like to just blow a little air through there to try and get out as much liquid as I can. Both because the antifreeze in this car was changed fairly recently, and also because it is really a pain to try and get rid of antifreeze. I decided I'm going to reuse this antifreeze. I cleaned this drain pan really well, but there's a couple of pieces of dirt floating in it. I guess maybe it fell off the radiator. I doubt it was in the system. This is something that I made to strain old paint. Actually, an old whey protein bottle, and I cut a hole in the cap, and I stretched one of my wife's old stockings across there. Works great for straining paint. I have tried to use coffee filters in funnels to do stuff like this, and it takes hours to drain. It just does not seem to work. I tried paper towels also, and they seem to collapse in, and then it runs past them. So I think this is fine enough. I don't think this is a big deal. So I'm going to strain this through this into a clean old antifreeze bottle that I have, and I'm going to reuse it. So not only is using the nylon as a screen fast, but you can see it caught some dirt there, so good deal. Okay, I'm going to move on to removing the intake manifold. So the first thing you need to do is pop this cover off. For anybody who hasn't done it, it's just snapped on, but you have to give it a pretty hard tug to remove. And these are the 4 points where that cover actually snapped onto there and there. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do to take off the valve or the intake manifold is remove wiring harness. So this is the connector that goes actually on the electric water pump. It's down underneath the hybrid starter generator. And there's a connector on the hybrid starter generator, and you can see that the cabling goes across the top of the intake manifold. So I'm going to snap all of those off, and it looks like it goes down in here and connects also, but I think maybe I can just remove a lot of this and get it up out of the way. To remove the connector from the electric water pump, there is a technical service bulletin. It's number 16-01-020, and it describes the procedure for how to remove that. There's a tab that you have to pull first, and then you can pull the bar back and remove it. So I suggest that you look at that. Okay, so as I remove this wiring harness, or just enough to get it out of the way, I see that there are an awful lot of connectors down in low there that need to be removed. And so it's not in the procedure, but I'm actually going to remove the top radiator hose since I have the radiator drain anyway, and just disconnect it there, disconnect that 10 millimeter, and flip it up out of the way. I think it's going to give me a lot more room to work. Okay, I think that was a good call. I removed the side of that, disconnected the side, and just flipped it over. Hopefully bending it that hard isn't going to cause a problem. But now I can get at all these connectors pretty easily. And since I have to remove this hybrid coolant line off of the intake manifold anyway, I remove that and I can push that out of the way. So now I'm going to finish taking off the rest of these connectors and getting this harness out of the way. Okay, this large connector on the hybrid starter generator, it has a little green tab. You need to get a screwdriver in there and pop that out. And then you can turn that handle and release that connector and get it out. The hybrid starter generator connector took a considerable amount of force to get off. I'm not looking forward to putting it back on, but I guess it makes sense that it's on so well since it is the generator for a 400 and some volt system. After I took that off, I see really to get the cable out of the way, there's a second connector, and again, it's got a little green locking tab that you have to pull out. And so I'm going to remove that. A little hard to get a video of, but the two lowest connectors, you're better off doing from the bottom of the car. They both have detents you have to push to release them. That's one. The other one's right in there. It's not easy to see. I apologize. But yeah, some of this you're doing by sense of smell because you can't look at it and do it. You're just feeling around the connector for the tab you got to push. Sometimes it's on the opposite side of the connector from where your arm is. This connector way down here by the AC compressor was the worst of all of them. With all these connectors, with the exception of the high voltage you have to pull out a tab like I showed on both of those. All the rest of them you have to squeeze or depress something, and this one I couldn't find. I'll show you and when I pull it out where I had to push. And the only other one is, if I can find it, is this one where I had to actually get a screwdriver underneath this tab and lift it a little bit to get it off. This is the connector I said was difficult, and what I actually had to do was put a screwdriver in here and push this way down to depress that. I could not depress that just by squeezing with my finger hard enough to get that off. Okay, so I have the wiring harness off there. I have all the parts that went down into the engine, and they're all pushed back there. I removed this bracket from the side so that I had a little play, and I can move this out of the way as I pull off the intake manifold. Okay, so now I'm going to take off these two nuts so I can pull this off of the intake manifold. And there's 4 bolts around the throttle body that I'm going to remove, and then I'm just going to try and pull the throttle body away. I think everything so far has been 10 millimeter, except I guess this is an exhaust gas recirculation pipe. On this side, they were both 12 millimeter. You can't get it off unless you at least loosen the other side, and that's also a 12 millimeter there, but on the other side, which is extremely hard to see, it's actually a 14 millimeter. So loosen those up and then that comes off. It looks to me at this point like there's a bolt. There's 3 bolts on the bottom, a bolt there, and a bolt over here, and then 2 nuts on the top holding the intake manifold on. They're all 12 millimeter, and there's also a coolant pipe. I'm going to remove it up here and just pull it back. Okay, so once I loosen a bolt someplace I can't get it, I'm a big fan of magnets. I just tape one of those high power magnets onto a piece of wood, and out it comes. Okay, after giving a really hard tug, we have the intake manifold loose. It's not coming off, and I can see down in here, there's a 12 millimeter bolt that needs to be removed there, and then there's a 10 millimeter holding a bracket on that holds these connectors and wires, so that needs to come off too. So I'm going to take these 2 off and try again. Okay, those were the last 2 bolts that had to be removed. They're difficult to get at. I'd recommend going to a 1/4 inch socket set because there's very little room to move. If you've removed the main splash shield, the back splash shield, and you have the car lifted up and you get underneath, it's probably easier to get at them from the bottom, but because I don't have the car jacked up, I didn't have enough room to do it that way. So the next thing that we need to do is remove the hybrid starter generator. And to do that, you need to remove the serpentine belt. There are two springs. There's a front spring and a rear spring that tension that belt. And the rear spring is very, very difficult to compress. I replaced the belt on this before, and you can buy what's basically a spring compressor, I suppose. I never really looked at it, but I didn't want to buy an expensive tool that I'd only used once. So I made a spring compressor specifically for this job. I'm always doing projects, and I did a project where I actually used some old bed frame because it's very hard steel. And so all this is two scrap pieces of bed frame, a long carriage bolt, and then two, I guess, like number 10 screws that are going to hold it on the top part of it. So you'll see how I use this, but this works pretty well for compressing the spring. If you make something like this, please be careful. Again, I do things that I don't necessarily want to tell others to do. If I hurt myself, it's one thing. I would never want anyone to hurt themselves. Okay, so the front spring's pretty easy. It's actually on the hybrid starter generator. There's this weird looking nut on here that you can get a hold of with a 12-point socket. It's 17 millimeter. So you put that brake bar on that, lift it up, compresses, and then there's a hole here that you can put a pin in. I just put an Allen wrench in there to hold it in place. Okay, so like I said, that was the easy one. I just moved that with the bar and then put an Allen wrench in there to hold it in place. This is the back one, and this is the one that, if you look online, almost everybody will complain about. So I'm going to put my homemade spring compressor on that and tighten down the carriage bolt to compress that spring. Okay, so I put the bottom of the compressor, that angle steel, underneath that arm, and then I put a little piece of wood and a shim against the side of the car to hold it in place, make sure it doesn't move off. And then on the top part of the compressor, I just tap a piece of scrap wood between that, I guess it's an AC pipe, and the compressor, both to protect the pipe and to hold the top of the compressor, that angle right on top of the spring. So I tighten that with a deep wall socket and a flex extension. And then once you've done that, there's plenty of slop in the belt. The belt's real loose now. So now I think I can take off the starter generator. Okay, looks like we got two 12 millimeter bolts on this side of the starter generator that I already loosened. And looks like we have one bolt on this side, right there. And we're gonna, oh, I'm sorry, right there, it's 14 millimeter. So let me point to that down there. So we'll take those out and see if it comes off. After removing those three bolts, the starter generator doesn't want to budge. So I'm going to try loosening up these two bolts that go into the engine block to let this bracket flex a little bit and see if I can get it off. I had watched somebody else's video on removing some of the parts on the engine, including the hybrid starter generator, and they pointed out the brackets and they pointed out that long bolt that goes through the top. And what they didn't point out was there is another bolt straight in on the bottom of this. I have been fighting to get this out. I actually have to admit that I tried to use leverage against the belt tensioner and I broke that. So that's $100 more I wasted. And I took the serpentine belt off, which is just a pain to put back on, but that's fine. So now I'm going to remove that bolt. I think it's probably another 12 millimeter. And now I suspect this is going to come out. I really had thought that it was, and it really is. It's very, very, very tight here. That is an incredibly snug fit where that bolt goes through. And there's actually a bushing that was sticking out. You can see the back of it there. It looks like a nut. And now you can see I have it moved away, so I tapped that out, and then that loosened up a bit, but that was extremely tight till I moved that bushing. So, hey, mistakes are made. Okay, here you can see where that last bolt is that's on the bottom. So I feel like a horse's patoot that I tried to leverage that. Fortunately, I only broke the one part and not the main part, and I still will publish this video, so hopefully I save you heartache when you do it. Now that that's out though, we can fully see the electric water pump, and now we're going to remove that. And again, you know, I'm not completely sure how much loosening up and moving the hybrid starter generator helps. If I had to do this over again, I think I would try it without removing it. This coolant hose on the electric water pump had both a spring clamp and a more traditional radiator clamp that someone put on it. Looks pretty bad to me, so I'm planning on replacing this hose. Okay, the 3 bolts on the top of the water pump holding it to the block are removed. Removed both of the hoses, and also removed the 2 nuts that hold on the plastic water pipe that covers the thermostat. You can see the thermostat right there. And since we have the brand new water pump here, we can see that there are also 2 bolts underneath that we're going to have to get at. So I took the HSG and I bungee corded it up to try and give me as much room as I can to try and get under there. One of the bottom bolts was pretty tight. I had to use a brake bar, but other than that, came out pretty easy. So now we gotta put the new one in. I picked up a replacement coolant hose from the local Hyundai dealership. You can see the part number right there to replace that one that was double clamped and looks kind of nasty. The new one does come with new spring clamps, so I'll use those. And this is the pipe from the electric water pump from the outlet near the thermostat that goes across to the engine. The new water pump is completely installed. On the bottom hose, I replaced the spring clamp, a little hard to see, with a regular hose clamp, whatever they're called. And the new hose came with 2 new spring clamps, so I used that. I just don't like reusing the spring clamps, but since that came with new ones, I thought that was fine. The thermostat inside here, I boiled some water with a thermometer. I tested it, and it opens at the correct temperature. All of the 12-millimeter bolts and nuts have been torqued to 17 foot-pounds, and all of the bolts that hold the water pump onto the block, they had Loctite on them, and so I put some blue Loctite on all of those before reinstalling them. I've reinstalled the hybrid starter generator. First thing I did was I put in this long steel bolt that goes through the top, and I tightened that all the way in, just finger tight though, and made sure that was sitting in there. Then I went to the 14-millimeter bolt underneath. I tightened that finger tight all the way in. Then I put the bracket in with the 2 14-millimeter bolts on the engine block, tighten those finger tight. The 2 12-millimeter bolts that go into the HSG, I tighten those finger tight. Then I torqued this top bolt. I pushed on the generator to make sure it was all the way in against the block, and I torqued that to 45 foot-pounds because it's steel on steel. I figured I could take that torque. The bottom 14-millimeter bolt that goes into the aluminum block, I torqued to 30 foot-pounds. Then I torqued these 2 14-millimeter bolts that go into the block, again to 30 foot-pounds, and the 2 12-millimeter bolts that go into the HSG, I torqued to 17 foot-pounds. On the bottom is the original front Serpentine Belt Tensioner that I broke, and above it is the new one that I ordered. I ordered that off of eBay, and I'll put the link on eBay. Hopefully you won't need it if you follow this video and you don't do what I did. And if you can see it, that is the part number on it. So it's an exact match. The only difference with the new one from the old one is the new one has this little aluminum pin thing coming out of it, and the old one does not have that. But it goes on a place on the hybrid starter generator where that won't touch anything. So I'm not sure. Perhaps that's for a different vehicle that it's used on. Not sure. The new one also, I thought this was funny, comes with the the pin already inserted in it to compress the spring. I carefully rerouted the serpentine belt. Some of this you need to do from the bottom, some from the top. It's a bit of a pain. Probably easier if you have a second set of hands, but certainly doable by yourself. And then I replaced the front belt tensioner, and now I'm going to release the tension. I double checked that the serpentine belt is seated correctly in all the grooves. And by the way, I did torque both of those bolts that hold the front tensioner to the HSG to 17 foot-pounds also, because they're 12 millimeter into aluminum. Here is the homemade compression tool for the rear tensioner after using it. While the angle steel is hard, it's just a cheap 7-inch carriage bolt that bends. I didn't buy a better grade bolt since I only expected to use it once or twice. So I can see that the back of the throttle, the butterfly on the throttle body is kind of dirty, so I'm going to clean that while I have it open. So I used a little throttle body cleaner to clean that, and came out nice and clean. When I clean something like this, well, in here, because I didn't want it to go in the engine, I put some plastic down and then a rag to catch the liquid. But when I clean something that has carbon buildup on it, I try and just use a soft toothbrush, and at the most, if there's like a real hard deposit somewhere, I'll use a scrap of wood or something soft, because you do not want to scratch the metal. I'm going to reinstall the intake manifold. So what I did after I took it off was I vacuumed, because there's a lot of places where there was some dirt right above the intake. Being a little paranoid, I also had a crevice tool that fit into these intakes real nicely, and I put it in there just to make sure if any little pieces fell in, I could vacuum those out. Then when I cleaned the throttle body, I also used some carb cleaner and a cloth and just wiped over this. And that's perfectly smooth and clean. And that's definitely something you do not want to use anything that could scratch that aluminum, because you don't want an intake leak. Before I put the intake manifold back on, while I still had easy access to these connectors, I wanted to work on making sure I could get these tabs pushed back in. They were very hard to release, and when I tried to push them back in now, they're very hard to push back in. So I took a little bit of silicone lubricant and I put it on some of the mating surfaces there, just a little bit. You don't want to make it sloppy. And the bigger one, this goes in much more easily now. It didn't have as much success with the smaller one, but best I could do. The gaskets for the intake manifold and for the throttle body looked okay, but I figured while I had this apart, I would get new gaskets and replace those. So I turned over and tapped the intake manifold just to make sure there was nothing loose inside here, and there wasn't. And then I vacuumed off the face of this, removed the old gaskets, wiped off the faces just inside the gasket area, and I put the new gaskets in. I'm kind of glad I put the new gaskets in. The old ones, they're not completely hard, but they were definitely harder than the new gaskets. And the gaskets were very inexpensive, so I think that was a good idea. I wiped off the throttle body area and replaced that gasket also. I see that this exhaust gas recirculation has a gasket here. I didn't know that. I didn't buy that gasket, so that's going to keep the old one, and if there's problems, at least that's not hard to get to, but I doubt there'll be a problem with it. Because the 3 bolts that hold on the intake manifold, especially the center one, are very difficult to seat. I actually put those in before I put the intake manifold on. You don't really have to do the side ones because you can get to those, but this center one, I'd recommend you stick it through and then hold the intake manifold so it doesn't fall back out again, and then put it on. And I just rested it on the 2 bolts that come out, and then I can put the nuts on those to hold it in place. The one coolant pipe, or not sure it's a coolant pipe, but the pipe comes up here. The other pipe you have to thread in. It goes sort of behind the throttle body, and it's going to go on here. So now I'm going to start connecting things, and we'll go from there. You replace the intake manifold, make sure you have it sitting on top of this bottom bracket where this bottom bolt comes up through. The other thing that you want to make sure of is that this exhaust gas recirculation pipe that you get that on. If you can't get this metal pipe onto those two bolts if you have this all the way on. So make sure you seat those two things and then put it on. I then torqued all of the 12 millimeter nuts and bolts to 17 foot-pounds. The 10 millimeter bolts that are holding the throttle body on, I torqued to 7.5. They go into inserts in plastic, and I didn't want to make them a whole lot tighter than that. You can see I covered up the throttle body with some plastic just to make sure no dirt fell in it as I did all of that. I reconnected this top hose that comes off the intake manifold. I guess that's a PVC valve. I said I don't like reusing spring clamps, but on something like that, I'm not too worried about it. I try to make sure I put the clamp in exactly the same spot. Similarly, there's another hose here that I put back on, and again, reuse the spring clamp, making sure I put it in the same spot. I had taken this bracket off to give me some working room, so I put that back on. 10 millimeter bolt, I just pulled it nice and snug. Now it's time to put all the connectors back on. It's always amazing how much easier connectors go on than come off. So the two very bottommost connectors, again, worked on those from underneath the car. And then there were several brackets that held the connectors in place. I had to replace all those, including one right on the bottom of the intake manifold. Probably the hardest connector to get back on, and it's almost impossible to see, is you can just see a tiny bit of it maybe there, and that's the connector that goes onto the electric water pump itself. But everything's on, everything's snapped together well. All of them are 10 millimeters, so I just snugged them up with what I thought was right. So getting close to the end. Reinstalled the top radiator hose, putting this bracket back on, and this is definitely a place where I don't trust reusing the old spring clamp, so I put a brand new radiator hose clamp on there. Reinstalled the hose between the airbox and the throttle body, and again, I have no problem reusing a spring clamp on a hose like that. I reinstalled this front plastic duct that goes to the airbox. 2 of the 3 push clips were broken. I bought a bag of these a while ago. They're really cheap on Amazon, so I can replace them when they break. Top cover reinstalled, and everything in the engine compartment is put back together. I need to put the bolts in the splash shield under the car, and I've already tightened up the drain plug for the radiator, so that was closed a while ago. After reinstalling the front splash shield, I reconnected the car battery and then the high voltage battery pack. I then siphoned the antifreeze out of the antifreeze container into the coolant system to try and make sure I didn't pick up any sediment in the bottom of the antifreeze container. After refilling the coolant system to as much as it would hold, I started the car. Now I'm letting it run for at least 15 minutes. I'm monitoring the engine temperature, and then I'll let it cool down, and I'll add coolant to the system as required. After driving the car for 1 day, it needed a bit more 50-50 coolant mix. It's been used regularly for 2 weeks since this repair and works perfectly with no warning messages or coolant leaks. So the gremlin has been defeated for now. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel to see all of my videos. Links to some of the parts and tools used in this video are included below. I am a shopping affiliate, and I do earn a small commission if you choose to purchase something via these links. Thank you.